Police. We know them, we call them, we usually don't want them following us. But how did the whole policing thing even start? To answer that, we're gonna take a trip from ancient baboon-using Egypt to modern SWAT trucks rolling through suburbia. Strap in, it's about to get weird. Okay, so ancient China, they had this whole prefecture thing where prefects were basically hall monitors who handled crime. Local magistrates hired them, and for thousands of years they were like neighborhood managers who handled complaints and could even arrest people. They had sub-prefects too to help break down the workload.
The workload destroys
Bureaucracy at its finest. And fun fact, prefects could be women. Ancient gender equality points, anyone? Then there's Babylonia, where law enforcement started off as military guys with power complexes. Sound familiar? They were eventually replaced by officers called Pacatus, who did exactly the same thing. They were like the empire's go-to folks for investigations and getting the bad guys behind bars. And don't get me started on ancient Egypt, which had police using monkeys and trained baboons. I'd love to say this was a one-off, but no, they actually used animals for border security, guarding the rich, and even arresting criminals. You know what? Let's bring back baboon cops. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, it's 300 BC, and Athens thought it was a great idea to make slaves into a police force. Yeah, the Scythian archers, publicly owned slaves who doubled as guards. They'd patrol public spaces, keep crowds in line, and catch criminals. In Sparta, they had the ephors as judges, and just in case anyone thought they were living a little too free, a secret police called the Crypteia to spy on the locals. Then Rome comes along. They built an empire. They perfected indoor plumbing.
shit!
And then, naturally, they decided they needed vigiles, basically a combo firefighter / night watch. They had to chase down runaway slaves, put out fires, and break up the rowdy nighttime scenes. The really fun gigs went to the Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to keep the emperor safe, but often became a bigger threat to him. By the time Augustus came around, we also got urban cohorts. They handled city riots, but sometimes caused them too. Jumping to medieval England, they had what we call the mutual pledge system, which was fancy for, if someone in your neighborhood messes up, everyone pays the price. Local tithings of 10 families each would keep each other in line. And for bigger stuff, they had hundreds, the equivalent of the neighborhood snitch who'd haul people in front of the Shire Reeve. Fun fact, this is where we get the word sheriff. Yep, that guy in the old westerns. His title goes all the way back to medieval England, wrangling criminals and collecting taxes. Over in medieval Spain, they decided they needed a little more muscle, so they made the Santas Hermandades, which sounds holy, but was really just knights for hire keeping peace on the Camino de Santiago. They eventually became a full-blown police force, kind of like medieval highway patrol, except instead of a badge, it was a sword. These guys would outlast a lot of Spanish kings and didn't actually get shut down until 1835. What a run. Over in the medieval Islamic world, they had the Shurta, an all-purpose police force that doubled as internal security. These guys dealt with everything from customs enforcement to trash collection. Mutasib were a sort of economic watchdog, making sure no one was shortchanging anyone at the bazaar. So, yes, even 1,000 years ago, someone was out there policing for fair prices. Let's zoom ahead to early modern Europe, where in France, King Louis XIV created the Maréchaussée, uniformed police with a focus on enforcing peace in the capital. It wasn't exactly what we'd call gentle. Think of it as a mix between riot control and paramilitary police. Italy had Birri, who were notorious for their brutality. The cops in Bologna wore uniforms, carried swords, and were more feared than loved. But hey, effective policing doesn't always mean polite policing. Now, onto colonial America, where crime prevention boiled down to citizen night watches. They'd walk the streets, shout warnings, and mostly avoid getting involved. The South, however, went a darker route. They created slave patrols, with the sole purpose of keeping slaves from escaping or revolting. This was the origin of policing in the South, and the chain of command included the sheriff, who would sometimes double as the local enforcer for the plantations. Meanwhile, the Wild West. This is where the lone sheriff becomes iconic, keeping law and order in rough towns with a six-shooter and a horse. Fun fact though, sheriffs in real life spent more time handling disputes over cattle theft than actual gunfights. Now we're in the 1800s. London, 1829. The Industrial Revolution has people stacked on top of each other. Crime was off the charts, so Sir Robert Peel figured, why not try uniformed police? Bobbies hit the streets, and the Peelian principles are born. His big idea? Police exist to prevent crime, not just chase it down after the fact. This was also the dawn of policing by consent, rather than fear. Peel wanted the public on his side, not hiding from his officers. So Peel's force became a blueprint for police forces worldwide, and police got fancy helmets and whistles instead of swords. Across the Atlantic, the US was doing its own thing. Boston, New York, and Philly each set up police departments in the mid-1800s, copying a bit from Peel but adding some classic American improvisation. The South's slave patrols were disbanded after the Civil War, but the structure and tactics they used were absorbed into modern policing, a legacy that left some deep-seated mistrust in American society. Early 1900s, welcome to the age of tech. Cops get cars, radios, and phones. Now they could actually respond to crimes in real time. In the 20s, police corruption was practically a job requirement in some cities. August Vollmer, he's the first to suggest using things like fingerprinting and polygraphs. That's right, he brought science to policing. His student, O.W. Wilson, brought in the big city reforms: pay cops better, get them in shape, and rotate them across neighborhoods so they didn't get too cozy with the locals or the criminals. By the 60s, things were tense, and by the 90s, people weren't thrilled about cops rolling through neighborhoods like military units. Enter community policing. It's all about trying to get the public to actually like the police, or at least tolerate them. Then came broken windows policing, which basically says, stop the small stuff, and the big stuff might not happen. It became infamous in New York City under Mayor Giuliani, but over time, a lot of cities turned it down a notch. And then there's militarization. The 1033 program has tanks, tactical gear, and heavy arms flooding into small-town police forces. Sure, this works for a riot, but now they're bringing SWAT gear to car accidents. On the global stage, most countries have their own take on policing. France has the gendarmerie, a military force acting as police in rural areas. Interpol shows up on the scene in 1923 to help cops work together internationally. And now it's the go-to guy for transnational crime info sharing. Modern policing becomes less about catching criminals and more about stopping them before they even think about committing crimes. Or at least, that's the goal. Of course, it's not all good. We've got issues like police brutality, racial profiling, corruption, and qualified immunity. Reformers argue for de-escalation training and accountability, while others call for a total reimagining of the police. Still, as controversial as the role is, modern police forces are embedded in society. And that's the history of the police, I guess. From baboons in ancient Egypt to armored SWAT tanks, it's clear that policing has taken a few wild turns. We've got them catching criminals, directing traffic, and sometimes just making sure the neighborhood's in one piece. It's a job that's as old as civilization, and as long as humans keep causing trouble, someone will always be there to chase them down. Like and subscribe for more guard guides, and be safe.